Our next speaker is Professor Jeffrey Sachs. He's director of the Earth Institute at Columbia University. And he's, of course, one of the world's leading experts on economic development and the fight against poverty. And he has played a key role in the development of the new Sustainable Development Goals. Professor Sachs has written one of the articles in our report, The End of Nordic Exceptionalism. And a shorter version of his article and the text is published today in the Norwegian newspaper Dagens Næringsliv, so I encourage you all to go and check it out. And the title of his article is Why the World Needs the Nordics More Than Ever. Professor Sachs is with us on video link today, so we're hoping that technology is serving us well. He will be live from the G20 meeting in Istanbul. There we have Mr. Sachs. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you. Can you see me and can you hear me?
Definitely.
Very good. Thank you very much. Frankly, I can't bear to think of a world without Nordic exceptionalism, except if the whole world becomes like the Nordic countries. But I just beg you, don't become like the rest of the world is right now. We really need the leadership that the Nordic countries have been providing uniquely over recent decades, actually, in international development. That is leadership that is morally inspired, that is grounded in serious evidence-based approaches, and that is generous. Because, of course, the Nordic countries have been the countries that have fulfilled the international pledges on development assistance. Eric Solheim was just telling you all the very powerful reasons. He's a great leader in international development, one of the greatest, and he was giving you a very, very clear account. Frankly, I can say to you from my perspective as the UN's lead advisor on the Millennium Development Goals during these past 15 years and working very, very hard to get the new Sustainable Development Goals off the ground, that it's a shocking period, actually, for me, that we have to even confront all of the pressures right now on aid budgets, which never reached the levels that they should have reached globally, but now are under even more strain. And it's a bit of a shock for me that the strains are not only in my country, the United States, I'm used to that, or in other parts of the donor world that have been deficient, but now the strains are also in the Nordic countries. I was in Scandinavia, I was in Sweden, I should say, Stockholm, just a few days ago. The day was consumed by the risk that because of the refugee crisis, it's being discussed, although I find it inconceivable, frankly, that CETA's budget would be cut by half or even more in 2016 to make room for the refugee spending. It's a completely wrong-headed idea. Under DAC rules, it might be allowed to count the first year of refugee spending within your countries as ODA, as official development assistance, but even if it's allowed, it doesn't even remotely begin to make it appropriate. And what I argued as strenuously as I could in Sweden is that when you face a temporary shock like this refugee crisis, don't fund it by gutting fundamental programs of foreign policy like official development assistance, and certainly don't think that development aid is a kind of hobby or incidental activity that you can turn on and off at convenience. Programs that CETA runs, that NORAD runs, that the Norwegian government has led for so many years on avoided deforestation or on healthcare, where Norway has been a world champion, are programs that take years, indeed a decade or more, to build, to operate in a serious, highly professional, highly efficient way. They can't be tampered with year to year at a political whim and still end up with something that is at all meaningful. The fact of the matter is that development aid really works. This is perhaps the most important single point to make to anybody contemplating the question of aid. Back in 2000, when the Millennium Development Goals were just announced, and I was advocating together with Dr. Brundtland and Jonas Torre and Torre Gadal and others for a scale-up of development aid for health, we were constantly told, oh, but aid doesn't work. It's just a waste. It's not possible to give AIDS medicines in poor countries. You can't distribute anti-malaria bed nets because they'll be lost, wasted, stolen, and so forth. Truly, I never heard such arguments in Scandinavia, at least until recently, but I did hear them all the time in my own country in the United States, and I heard that kind of skepticism or cynicism, as Eric was just calling it, in many places. But I can tell you 15 years later, absolutely rigorously and succinctly, wherever added resources were brought to bear in the Millennium Development Goals, and especially in areas like health and education, they delivered just what they said and even more. Take the case of AIDS and malaria, where I was involved early on in designing the global fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria. And all of those negative arguments were given. What do we see now, 15 years later? Malaria deaths are down by 60% from their peak, maybe even more, because I'm looking at data that is a year or two old. Now there are 15 million people alive today on antiretroviral medicines that would have been dead were it not for the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria. Millions and millions of children have been saved from deaths from vaccine-preventable diseases. Maternal deaths in pregnancy and childbirth have been cut by half because of programs like Every Woman, Every Child. You look at deforestation, to take a different area. You know that Norway staked a major program with Brazil to fight deforestation. And just the inspiration of that program focused political attention in Brazil and organizational attention, so that even aside from the specifics of the Norway funding, Brazil really scaled up its fight on deforestation in the Amazon, and amazing things are happening using technology to track products. So, for example, soybeans that are produced on deforested marginal lands of the Amazon are now tracked, and they don't go into the supply chain anymore because buyers won't have it. And this has led, through market forces, to the enforcement of the deforestation prohibitions that are now really showing results in Brazil. So my bottom line is that as a first point, the aid really works. And it works specifically in those targeted areas where you can quantify what is supposed to be done. You can link them to goals like the new Sustainable Development Goals. You deploy best practices and best technologies. You use monitoring to measure what's actually happening and to assess and to create feedbacks so that if things aren't working, corrections are made. In those circumstances, the aid has life-saving, really magnificent effects for very low cost translated into huge benefits. The second point is the aid is needed. It's especially needed, just as Eric Solheim said a moment ago, because we're at the start of a new, crucial phase of global cooperation, the Sustainable Development Goals. They're not even 2 months old. They were adopted on September 25th. They are bold, they are innovative. If you want to know the truth, SDG, which stands for Sustainable Development Goals, I say also stands for Social Democratic Goals, because I think that the SDGs really reflect social democratic values in a small s, small d sense. I don't mean a political party, but I mean the ethos of the Nordic world, that you combine economic prosperity, social inclusion, and environmental sustainability. That's the purpose of these sustainable development goals. Like any global goals, they can make a huge difference, but only if they stick, only if they are seen to be effective in the early stages so that they attract other supporters. And in this sense, pulling back from the SDGs at this moment would be devastating, actually unthinkable, and really, for me, unimaginable to occur in the Nordic countries if I weren't alerted by friends that indeed these pressures exist. In fact, I'm counting on Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, the rest of the Nordic world to step up, not to pull back, and to continue to show the kind of intellectual leadership that is the hallmark of your region. So, for example, Norway has been the champion, and I tip my hat to Jonas Støre, who made health diplomacy a central feature of Norway's foreign policy, and to Tore Gadal, who's one of the great practitioners of public health in the world. Norway has started in this government the new global financing facility for women and children's health in partnership with the World Bank. I'm working with the World Bank team to do everything I can to help make this GFF effective. But the idea that there could be some pullback at this moment now, it's nothing short of alarming, because this is a new initiative absolutely vital for SDG 3, which calls for universal health coverage. I'll give you another example of Norway, which is that Norway has established the Gordon Brown Commission on expanding access to quality education. And that is a commission that will report on education financing for SDG 4 to the Secretary General next spring or summer. This is another wonderful initiative of this government, and Borje Brende, and Prime Minister, and the whole Norwegian government is behind this. It's a wonderful contribution, and it's going to produce a powerful report that I believe should, and I think will, call for a new global fund for education to be a complement to the global fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria, and that will build on the same kind of example and build on the global partnership for education. Now, how could the Nordics pull back at this moment when we're about to have, through the leadership of Norway, a report that's going to call on us rightly to do more to achieve SDG 4 on universal health coverage? Or I could cite Sweden's leadership at the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals to bring together 9 governments at the head of state, head of government level to champion the SDGs in their first year. And that high-level group, HLG, of the Sustainable Development Goals, led by Prime Minister Levin, will report back in a year's time to the General Assembly. This is Sweden, together with Colombia, Germany, Timor-Leste, South Africa, Tunisia, and other governments taking on the Sustainable Development Goals at the head of government level. Well, what are they going to report back? Well, we've decided we're not so interested after all? Or are they going to report the typical Nordic report, which is that we're all in, we're stepping up our engagement, and we're showing the path forward? And as a final point, I would mention, of course, the climate negotiations that are going to start in Paris in 18 days. We need climate financing. We need climate financing that doesn't come out of more traditional official development assistance, because if the poor countries see that climate financing is nothing more than a parlor trick where their aid is taken from one hand and given to another, we're not going to have the global cooperation to reach a real agreement that's truly operational to fight climate change. So, ladies and gentlemen, first, I salute all of you for your leadership, because it's made a huge difference in the world. I've seen it and I've lived it for decades as a development practitioner and as a senior UN leader. Second is to say, at this moment, we need the Nordic leadership more than ever. As the title to my op-ed today in the newspaper says, it's not simply rhetorical, it's literal. We're at the start of the Sustainable Development Goals. We're on the eve of the climate negotiations. We're in the midst of launching the Global Financing Facility for Women and Children's Health. We're in the midst of the Brown Commission on scaling up financing for education. We're in the beginning of the new high-level group convened by Sweden's Prime Minister to engage countries around the world to tell the General Assembly, yes, these goals are real. And finally, we're at the very start of what should be celebrated in Scandinavia and in the Nordic countries. We're in the start of social democratic ideas being taken on as universal objectives. If I or you had been told a few years ago that all 193 member governments of the United Nations would endorse an agenda that puts sustainable development at the central part of the world cooperation, that looks for a holism of economic development, social inclusion, and environmental sustainability, that creates a new global mechanism of accountability, a high-level political forum, to put these values into practice, you would say, my God, if we ever got to there, this will just cause us to redouble our efforts. And I think that is truly the response that all of us needs to take right now. We have a chance. It's not for sure, it's fragile, but it's real. We have a chance to put these wonderful values that you have led on for so long as the world's shared agenda. And so please keep up your leadership. Please call on me at any time to help you to do the things that you do in such an amazing way. The world really needs you. It does need you more than ever. And I count on your leadership and am always thrilled to be alongside the Nordic leadership at any time that I can. Thank you for letting me join you from Turkey today, and all best wishes on your conference. And please stay in touch so that I can help in any way. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to the professor. Thanks a lot.